Hello everybody, and it's time to get into another comparison video. Today we are jumping back over the Atlantic Ocean and we're going to Tennessee, and we're going to talk about Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. Now you may be saying, Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey, what's the difference between that and bourbon? Well, there's really no difference between the two once they go through the whole fermentation process and go through distillation. It's that last step that they go through, which is called the Lincoln County process, where they take bourbon and basically run it through charcoal. Sugar maple is what they use, and it's charred, and this, according to Tennessee, mellows it out and makes it a much more mellow experience. So that's the main difference between bourbon and Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. So next time you're watching GoldenEye or one of those James Bond movies where they constantly are calling Jack Daniels bourbon, you can be as fingers on the chalkboard as I am when I hear that. It's not, it was, but it's not anymore. All right, so what is George Dickel? Well, if you're from overseas, you may not see this quite as much as you would see Jack Daniels. This is a competitor to Jack Daniels, and it's actually the second biggest selling Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. And if you're for the underdog, these guys are the underdog, right? They're working their way up. Well, what's interesting is that George Dickel is... They've had their 8 and their 12, or their two standard whiskeys, for a long, long time. And just recently, when I was driving home from Kentucky, I stopped in a liquor store outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, and I discovered this, which was fascinating to me. Bottled in Bond, George Dickel. Well, I have a whole episode of Whiskey Lore, the podcast, about bottled in bond and where that law came from. But in a nutshell, and what's important to this whiskey is that this is 50% alcohol. It has to be 50% alcohol by law. It has to be at least 4 years old. This is 13 years old. And then there are other rules that go along with that, but I won't go into all that because I have a whole podcast episode about it. But basically, I paid $34 for a bottle of this bottled in bond. Recently it won an award, got a mention as being the best whiskey of the year, and when it did, suddenly now I'm seeing bottles of this going for $100. So I have enjoyed this one, as you can tell, but is it worth $100? Well, we did the poll, and I'll give you the results of the poll before we're done with this episode. But I want to give you a little background on George Dickel and kind of give you a feel for the difference between these two. First of all, they both have the same mash bill. And for anybody who's coming into this episode from overseas and maybe isn't as familiar with bourbon and Tennessee whiskey terminology, the mash bill is basically the recipe, the grain recipe. So both of these have 84% corn. Both of them have 8% rye and 8% malted barley. So we're apples to apples when it comes to the new make spirit that was put into both of these, or white dog as you'll hear over here. So then what is making these two different is the age. This is 13 years old, okay? And this one, going, oh, George Dickel 12. How old is that one? Well, it's like the 100 Years' War question. How long was the 100 Years' War? Not 100 years. This is not 12 years old. No, actually, this is probably closer to 6 to 8 years old. And nobody knows what the 12 is about. But there's an 8 and there's a 12. The 8 is not 8 years old. So don't be buying on age statement on this. And I have this whole thing about age statement that I'm going to get to after I do the tasting on these. But basically they're the same thing. It's just this one has been in the cask a bit longer. And so we're going to find out whether it's worth paying 2 to 4 times more for this bottle than you pay for this, which I think I paid $26 for this, and that's a liter versus 750 mils. So, I mean, that's a pretty sizable difference. So this needs to be really, really good for me to give it my thumbs up. And so let's do the tasting here. Talk a little bit too about George Dickel. If you ever go, because I did go and I really enjoyed my tour out there. It's at a distillery called Cascade Hollow. Okay, that's the name of the distillery. It's a little hard to find, and I'm going to tell you right now, if you're using your GPS or if you're doing Google Maps, download your maps, because it's in the middle of nowhere and there's not great signage to get out to it. So if you don't have your maps downloaded, you may end up getting lost. But it's a cool place to go out to, hang out and see. I didn't get a lot of pictures from there because that's one of those places where they say you can't take pictures with your cell phone because they're afraid of a spark, and you don't want sparks at distilleries and all that fun stuff. But whether you're into believing that or not, anyway, it's a great distillery to go out and visit. And if you're going to go do Jack Daniels, you should do this one too, because it's not that far away. So here's the thing. Oh man, there is a cinnamon. There's a vanilla. Vanilla's out front. And then there's corn. And those really stand out in this. And this is the George Dickel 12. So interesting nose on that one. Nice flavors. It does actually smell pretty sweet. And then you pull this one up, and it is totally different. This one is nutty. It's got an oak smell. So musty. Here's the thing I'm going to say about this. It's so different from that one. This is what a whiskey warehouse smells like when you're not inside the barrel, you're outside the barrel, right? Yeah, this one, I mean, it does. It kind of gives off that little bit of an angel share kind of a smell. You're smelling more the wood than you're smelling the spirit that's inside the wood. It's so different. It's so different. And what's interesting to me, first thing that I noticed is that, look at the colors. This one is in almost twice this one's age. And this one is stronger than this one is. And there is a little bit more of a ruby red to this, but it's just that much. It's surprising. I would think there would be a much bigger difference in color between these two than there really is. So that's kind of a shock to me. But let's go into tasting and see what we got here. So I roll it to see the legs. There's an odd glue thing going on. I don't know if it's just today or what, but for some reason, ooh, and then that corn burn kind of hits towards the end. Here's the thing they call it the Kentucky hug in Kentucky. I guess we'll call it the Tennessee hug in this particular case. A lot of people think that comes from the rye. This is proof it comes from the corn. Corn it's going to give you that burn as you drink it, and it's part of the reason why scotches don't tend to give you quite that same aggressive burn that you get. It's not bad though. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't drink this fast. You're going to really feel it. But drinking it in smaller mouthfuls, it's there. You could probably dilute it a little bit, but I think that corn is still going to get you. I do believe, though, that the charcoal filtering that's supposed to mellow this out does do the job. If you want to understand the whole idea of this sugar maple mellowing of a whiskey, if you've ever had Gentleman Jack, to me, it's just like drinking pillow whiskey. It's too soft. And what they do is they put it through the charcoal filtering process twice instead of once. And to me, it's too much. It's like it's ripping all the heart out of the whiskey. But there's a lot of people who like it. And so I think it comes down to just what do you like? What are you into? And for me, in this case, the charcoal filtering doesn't really bother these two whiskeys too much. But in Gentleman Jack, it's just like one step too far. So on this one, I'm reading my notes as I go along. Because what's interesting is I said cinnamon, corn, and grain on that one for the palate. And the corn and grain, actually, the reason I came to that conclusion was because, yes, the corn is pretty heavy in the flavor on this one. But I kept thinking of Life cereal, or not Life cereal, Chex cereal. You remember Chex cereal? And they had corn Chex. It's what it tastes like to me. It tastes like corn Chex when it's in the middle of it. And then it's very kind of peppery as it goes away with that glue. And then I get what they call spoonbread. It's kind of like a moister cornbread kind of thing. It's buttery, and so I kind of get that out of that one. Whereas with this one, again, we get that nose is very oaky. There's almost like dark fruits when you let it slide to the sides of your tongue, at least mine. It's lighter in body than that whiskey is, a little bit. I don't know. This is my thing about age statements on whiskey. To me, bourbon has a sweet spot. Tennessee whiskey has a sweet spot. Anything you're drinking has a sweet spot. Every single whiskey you drink has a sweet spot. There's two ends of the spectrum. There's new make or white dog, and all the characteristics you get out of that. And then there's time in the barrel. And on this end of the scale is that oakiness that you're going to get out of being in the barrel for too long. If you like the oakiness, go for the age statement. If you're more into the robust flavors that come out of the new make, then age statement is actually going to be a deterrent after a certain period of time. And so you need to figure out where in that range your sweet spot is. I think everybody has a sweet spot that's good for them. And then I think that every whiskey has a sweet spot, and do you match up with that particular sweet spot? And when you find it, it's awesome, and that's a favorite whiskey. And when it's off too much this way or off too much this way, then that's where you go, man, I'm not really digging that as much. But your friend may say, man, that is one of the best whiskeys I've ever had. So just remember, tasting is always subjective. It's part of the reason why I kind of hung away from doing tasting notes for a long time, because I think everybody's palate is going to be different. Both of these kind of have that gluey kind of a finish on them. They're pleasant whiskeys. Both of them are pleasant whiskeys, but they're going to fit a particular palate. So the question is whether that's your palate or not. And after the voting was done, you guys were pretty much with me that it was 54% to 46% going with the 12. And I'm telling you, at a fraction of the price, I would definitely have this one in my cabinet. I think this is definitely a good whiskey. It's got its own personality to it. When I'm in the mood for Dickel, I'm drinking Dickel. Okay, it's not like Jack Daniels. It's not like any other whiskey that you've had. So definitely can be something worth tasting, seeing if you're into it. If you are, there's another one for your whiskey shelf. So hope you enjoyed the tasting notes. Would love to hear your feedback on what you think, which ones you like, and